I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skirts, or jean jorts. The Revolutionary War started as a colonial rebellion against the British on the fringes of its empire. It ended with an independent America and the idea of liberty spreading across the globe. All this happened because the rebels won the major battles. We're here to dive deep into each of them. Welcome to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast, hosted by James Early and Scott Rank. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our series, Key Battles in the Revolutionary War. We're almost at the end. In the last episode, the Americans were victorious at Yorktown. So, James, do you think we should just wrap things up and, finish, or do you think we should just throw in something extra as a complete aside to our series? Do you think we should focus an episode on that?
Yeah, our listeners know us well enough by now to realize we're not done just because we finished the last battle. There's so much more that could be talked about. Our intention in this series is not to give you a PhD level survey and lots of detail and talk about every single thing. If you want that, you can listen to the Michael Troy's podcast, and you should after you finish this one, of course. But we are just painting with a broad brush, just hitting the highlights. This is very much Revolutionary War 101. But there is one topic that's very near and dear to my heart and to Scott's, and that is espionage and spies. So we just couldn't resist devoting a sidetrack episode to that topic, to espionage, because there's so many cool stories regarding spies and espionage from the Revolutionary War period. So we hope you enjoy this.
This is something we both wanted to focus on because we've looked at battle tactics. We looked at how troops were able to defeat one another in battle. But if we're going to talk about war, we have to talk about spycraft. It's going on behind the scenes, but there are many who say Washington won the war, not because of his military strategy, but because of his role as a spy master. And this wasn't said by the Americans, but the British. So I think that's worth paying attention. So I'm going to first paint a broad brush of what spycraft meant at this time in history and then look at how it was utilized in the war. What I want to start off with is looking at spycraft in history. By no means is this something that is discovered in the Revolutionary War. Basically, at the beginning of warfare, spies are used. Sun Tzu has huge sections of it in The Art of Warfare where he talks about different types of spies, how you use double agents, infiltrators, everything else you can imagine. The Old Testament, whether you think it's true or not, there are large sections of it devoted to spycraft. Moses uses spies. Israel spies out the promised land before they enter it, and it's basically the narrative of the Jewish Exodus is largely shaped by spies gathering intelligence from foreign lands. In Greek and Roman military chronicles, spies are referenced basically as much as cavalry commanders and phalanx troops and archers. In the Roman Empire, the Frumentarii were one such spy group. They were originally wheat traders, but because they traveled throughout the empire and had tabs on what different people in the empire were up to, eventually they were recruited as the emperor's spy unit. And even the honey trap, which you see in all sorts of spy fiction and James Bond movies and other Cold War fiction, not a new idea. That also goes back to the ancient world. So it's something that's always existed, but when we're getting up to the 18th century, spycraft has become a little bit more sophisticated. And it started becoming more sophisticated in the 16th century when embassies are first established in the Italian city-states and then spread throughout Europe. Because now an enemy nation is literally in your backyard. And spycraft becomes more sophisticated. There is an arms race that develops among European and Mediterranean nations, and this is when large empires are growing and rivalries are forming, and you need more specialized intelligence. So spies from France and Spain and the Ottoman Empire and Venice and the Habsburg Empire are mastering this craft. And there's a doctoral thesis a friend of mine wrote on spies in the Mediterranean world. So spies provide the Empire with information on military and political developments, and they play an active role going between different capitals. There's a different approach to spycraft. The Habsburgs tried to centralize their secret service, which didn't really work too well. And others like England and the Ottoman Empire had a decentralized approach to their spy networks, and a spy master, his spies might further the spy master's interests more than the state itself. One excellent spy master was Queen Elizabeth's, Francis Walsingham, and he developed simple methods of cryptography and espionage, where he had methods of cryptoanalysis where he'd slice open wax seals of intercepted coded message with hot knives, then decipher messages and then reseal them and send them offward. He had an entire office in London where men were trained in deciphering codes and ciphers, and they could feign handwriting. He had cryptography experts and another expert at breaking fixed seals and resealing them. So this is happening 100 years before the Revolutionary War, and yeah, it's getting a little bit more sophisticated this time. So now let's look at what's actually going on in the colonies and what Washington is doing. The reconnaissance unit that Washington first forms, one of his subordinates forms, is called the Knowlton's Rangers. You hear me talking about them.
Woohoo! Knowlton's Rangers.
Not going to say anything more because you can hear at the end of every episode. But
every episode.
I'm nothing if not a salesman. It's in the glorious American tradition.
That's part of the business.
Yep. You got to make some scratch somehow, listeners. So what are the Knowlton's Rangers? They're a continental reconnaissance unit, and they were pretty short-lived. They're important at the beginning of the war, but then there's other units that are more important later on. So it's named after its commander, Thomas Knowlton, where George Washington made an attempt to combat the threat of British troops taking siege of New York. So he formed this elite group of soldiers commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton. Knowlton selected a group of 130 men and 20 officers from the Connecticut, Rhode Island, and Massachusetts regiments to carry out reconnaissance missions. The company was a reconnaissance company with orders to patrol the shoreline around Westchester and Manhattan, as well as other areas around a place called Hell Gate. And the newly formed American government didn't have a specific intelligence division, but commissioned men for espionage when the need arose. And besides providing tactical intelligence, the Knowlton's Rangers were also outfitted as a light infantry regiment, and they took part in several American Revolutionary War battles. So this is why the Knowlton's Rangers are considered the first organized American elite force. Unofficially, they're a predecessor to modern special forces like the Army Rangers or the Delta Force. So that's why the date 1776 on the modern U.S. Army Intelligence Service seal, it refers to the Knowlton's Rangers. There's not a direct line of continuity between the Knowlton's Rangers and the U.S. Army, but hey, I mean, it's whatever. I mean, modern governmental units and nations love to have a direct line. I'm sure Serbia directly connects itself with 1389 all the time, even though it's a little bit more jagged than they'd like to think. So just a little bit about what the Knowlton's Rangers did before I focus specifically on one of the people, the most famous members, arguably. They were scouting in advance of Washington's army at Harlem Heights, New York. While scouting out British outposts, they were engaged by elements of the Light Infantry Brigade commanded by Major General Alexander Leslie. The Rangers managed a successful retreat and later mounted a counterattack with the support of 3 companies of Wheaton's regiment, led by Major Andrew Light. And Washington ordered Knowlton to fall in the enemy's rear, while a feint in front engaged the British troops' attention. The attacking force turned prematurely and made contact with the British right flank instead, losing the element of surprise. In the face of heavy enemy fire, Knowlton rallied his troops to carry on the attack, and he fell mortally wounded in front of his men. So unfortunately, Knowlton's out pretty soon in the war, and they are engaging in both spying and regular military attack. Anything you want to mention, James, before I delve in more deeply on one of the most famous members of the Knowlton's Rangers?
No, I remember when we talked about the Battle of Harlem Heights, and it was tragic when Knowlton was killed. But yeah, Washington was constantly having to, in the beginning at least, to recruit, find, and then replace spies because they had a tendency to die on him. It's a very dangerous business.
Right, and it's something that Washington felt unsavory but necessary in war. And we're going to look specifically at Nathan Hale that we touched on briefly in the beginning of the series for his famous quote, "I regret that I have one life to give for my country." And I mean, I want to give credit to his sacrifice, but I will say that Hale, there are few people who have received as much disproportionate attention for what they did compared to the act itself. Hale was brave, don't want to take that away, and you'll see in the story, but there are probably hundreds or dozens at least of schools and other things named after him compared to major figures in the Revolutionary War that are almost completely forgotten and were major battle commanders that we don't know much about. So I'll mention his story and then we can discuss more if his attention is merited compared to his contribution. Well, anyway.
Nathan Hale, he's famous for getting hung and having a quote that he may not have even really said.
Right. I don't know how many, because we both read a book called Washington Spies about a spy ring, which we highly recommend if you want to know more about this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
And I think early in the book, it goes into when his famous quote first began to surface, and it was something like several decades after the fact, if that's, if we have that right.
It comes from one source, and that person wasn't even present at the hanging of Nathan Hale. So,
right.
Yeah, there you go.
It sort of smells like when you have stories of crazy things that Roman emperors did, but it's written by Suetonius 150 years after the emperor lived. And I don't know. It might be more the symbology of Nathan Hale as kind of a martyr, but I'm sorry, listeners, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm doing the academic thing where you talk about the historiography before you even actually say what happened.
Yeah. Let
me say what happened first before we talk about the historical debate. Okay, Nathan Hale. So he's born on June 6, 1755 in Coventry, Connecticut. He attended Yale and had a theological education. He joined the Revolutionary War effort and was commissioned as a first lieutenant and joined a march toward Cambridge to support other militia. Hale's regiment arrived at the Siege of Boston late in September 1775. Afterwards, he was commissioned captain in January in the newly formed 19th Connecticut Regiment for bravery displayed in the siege. And he received commendation for preventing men from deserting, which is an ongoing problem among the Continental Army that vexes Washington throughout the war, and he seems to be able to rally soldiers to stay on. Where he comes to prominence is when the siege of New York by the British was imminent. Washington didn't have enough soldiers or supplies to defend Manhattan, but he needed to learn where the British would attack. He decided to send a spy into British territory to learn of their invasion plans and immediately thought of Hale as someone to send in. He knew the young officer might balk at the assignment because at the time, spying was thought to be unbecoming of a gentleman, dishonorable, demeaning, and indecent act. Because when I was talking about how spycraft becomes more sophisticated in world history at this time, don't think of the CIA where you're recruited and this professional force and you're doing the 18th century version of wearing a tuxedo and going to Monte Carlo.
Yeah, and you get like a several week training course at Langley.
Yeah, it's not that. I mean, the Francis Walsingham.
There is no training in this. It's just figure it out as you go.
Yeah, it's sort of, well, you look like a smart young man, go do it. And Francis Walsingham, for example, the Queen Elizabeth's spy master, he learned of the invasion plans of the Spanish Armada, but his intelligence sources could be some shipmaster at a shipyard in Spain and somebody who frequently went to taverns and would listen to the drinking songs of Spanish soldiers and carpenters and things like that. So these it's almost like Sherlock Holmes, where his intelligence network were the homeless of London. That there's something pretty intelligent there that everyone overlooks the homeless, but they have their ears to the ground everywhere. And this is where intelligence officers could very well get their knowledge. And Washington might have thought, well, Hale has comported himself with dignity, but he was studying probably to become a clergyman that was polished and had this, Puritan air about him. So I wonder if he's really the right guy. But Knowlton is able to convince Hale to go behind enemy lines and report on the British Army. And he convinced him by pointing out the dire need for intelligence. And the quote is, "For not only the lives and fortunes of the entire army are at stake, but our mothers, our wives, and our children at home will fall a prey to the desperate and licentious creatures who mainly make up the British Army in America. That be a hero, and you could very well save the lives of hundreds, if not thousands. You could be ravaged by Hessians, and think of it that way." So Hale agrees, and he crosses into enemy territory disguised as a school teacher, which is what he was. So he knows what clothing to wear, how to carry himself, and pretends to be a loyalist is what he's going for. So he's ferried across on September 12th, and there's major risk because it's an act of spying that, if he were caught, is immediately punishable by death and pose great risk to him. So what Hale thought is that he could move among the various British camps openly and without suspicion as to his true intentions. He goes to taverns of British officers, and he lodges at the farmhouse of a loyalist named Johnson. And he would just strike up conversation about what's going on, mentioning that he was a teacher looking for a place to teach. And deep into the conversation, he would just indirectly and smoothly ask about what the British were up to, if he noticed any movement in British lines, and just trying to get any information he could. So Hale received basic intelligence from Johnson and then proceeded to the British camp 4 miles south. And he mingles freely with soldiers and goes to taverns, sketches enemy fortifications, and writes memoranda of the British troop numbers and positions. So to hide these sketches, he uses some of the spying cryptography methods of the time. He wore inner soles of his shoes, and underneath of these, he placed all of his drawings. And to hide these, he used Latin and algebraic characters for the fortifications' dimensions and descriptions written on thin paper. Something I forgot to mention, but this method of hiding this stuff also goes back to ancient spying techniques. There was a treatise written in, I think, 3rd century BC by the Greek military strategist Aeneas the Tactician. And he had huge sections in his treatise on cryptography and how to hide messages where, it's crazy stuff. Like, if you have a slave tattoo messages on his skull, shave his head, tattoo messages, and then let his hair grow back. And then when he arrives, shave his head, and there it is. So,
ouch.
Yeah, that limits the amount of messages you can hide. But there's all sorts of stuff like write things on an animal bladder, deflate it, then reinflate it. Really clever stuff. And this exact method of hiding things in the soles of your shoes is also mentioned. And this is what he does. I don't know if Nathan Hale would have read Aeneas the Tactician, but it could happen. They taught the classics in the Ivy League at that time period. I'd like to think so. It's an interesting thought. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors. I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skorts, or jean jorts. I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skorts, or jean jorts. So on the morning of September 21st, 1776, after spending a night in the company of drunken officers at a tavern, he probably heard drinking songs that he never heard at his theological education at Yale.
Yeah. You hope not.
Yeah. We'll find out later in the series, and we've probably mentioned that everyone is drinking all the time in the colonies. All the time.
all the time. Yeah.
Probably even the Puritans. Temperance as a movement hasn't taken on, so yeah. But it makes sense to be around officers after enough tankards of ale or rum. Maybe their lips will loosen up and they could reveal vital intelligence. Hale left the tavern an hour before dawn, and he learned that orders had been given to break camp and start for New York City. So it sounds like the invasion is imminent. Hale arrived at the shore of the Sound, and he expected to see a member of his company, Stephen Hempstead, who he had instructed 5 days earlier to send a boat for him on that morning. But as he approached the seafront, he was shocked to see a barge with at least 20 British Marines. Hale turned to run, but a voice calls out, "Surrender or die." He turns to see a score of musket barrels, knew that escape was impossible, and he raised his hands and submitted to capture, knowing that his fate was sealed. His captors knew of the methods of hiding messages, so they removed Hale's shoes, ripped open his soles, and saw sketches and notes of troop positions fall to the ground. He's then brought to General William Howe for questioning. The spy declared his name, rank in the American Army, and his objective in penetrating British lines. And again, all these things that happen afterwards, I think British sources talk about what happens here. In terms of what happens at his hanging, I don't even know if we have direct accounts. But Hale accepted charges of espionage. But what's interesting is he denied charges of treason because he said he never acknowledged George III as a sovereign. I don't think the British would really accept that as a effective, legal countermeasure.
Yeah. Oh, okay, you'll get off on a technicality. No, the British are not going to be sympathetic to that one bit.
It's not like there's a judge saying, "I'm willing to accept this," and then that General William Howe says, "Oh, okay." Although if anyone would have, it'd be Howe, since he has a soft spot for the colonists, but he doesn't. Hale is sentenced to hanging the next day without the pretense of a trial. Early the next morning, he's marched to the Park of Artillery, about 6 miles from the city. Troops place him in the custody of John Montresor, a British engineer, whom it was said that he had hardened his heart to human suffering and every softening sentiment of the heart. And this is where you can kind of hear that it's coming from American sources written much after the fact. And his jailer refused him the request of a clergyman to attend him or a Bible. So he is hung, and that's when he utters his immortal words, "I have one life to live for my country." Nathan Hale, there are statues of him, but I don't think we have any contemporary descriptions of his likeness. Maybe we do, but there are no sketches of him. So depictions of Nathan Hale are archetypal of what you would think a educated, brave young man would look like. And there are many schools, probably towns, statues, and other thing of Nathan Hale to this day. So
yeah, and he had a postage stamp in 1925 and 1929. So 1/2 cent.
So that's Nathan Hale. Any other thoughts about Nathan Hale you want to mention before we move on in espionage?
No, it's just interesting his alleged final words that "I regret that I only have but one life to give for my country." You know, those are taught. I don't know if they're still taught today. I don't know what gets taught in elementary schools. Not much, but I remember being taught that as a boy when I was in elementary school and one of these patriotic things. But as we mentioned already, that he may or may not have said that. If he did say it, he may have been quoting from a play that was well known at the time called Cato by Joseph Addison. It was an ideological inspiration to many Whigs, WHIGS. And I'm not referring obviously to the Whig party that's going to come up in the mid 1800s, or 1830s, 1840s. Whigs in this situation just means people who are more interested in a Republican style of government and opposed to the king and monarchy, at least to the degree that they can be. But I want to quote one quick passage from Cato that may have been his inspiration. It says, "How beautiful is death when earned by virtue! Who would not be that youth? What pity is it that we can die but once to serve our country?" So who knows whether Hale was quoting from this play or whether he even said anything like that. Sometimes the reality is much less picturesque and dramatic. He may have just said, who knows, freedom. I don't know. We just don't know. That's the problem with a lot of history. Is based on speculation, but it's a great story if nothing else.
Yeah, and again, listeners, if you think he said that, we don't want to take it away. We don't know he didn't say it, so go ahead. It's great speech. The sentiments are soaring, so yeah, great. Well, that's Nathan Hale, and that is the Knowlton's Rangers. The Knowlton's Rangers' symbolic importance is significant, but I would argue that the Culper Spy Ring does a lot more, and their influence is very significant in the war. So the Culper Spy Ring is this. Washington realizes that he needs a more organized approach to espionage. He can't just do it on a whim and find someone that he thinks is noble of heart and then has the heart and the gumption and then send him in and ad hoc it through the war.
Yeah, the Lone Ranger model doesn't work. We don't want any more Nathan Hales.
Yeah, maybe great for symbolic thing, but in terms of actionable intelligence, not so good. So Washington realizes that the tactic of sending scouts and military officers close to enemy lines, maybe on the cusp of battle, that's always necessary, but it doesn't offer insights into troops' future movements. Washington's forces are small, so he knew that perhaps a larger population of civilians could be called upon to help, and this sparks the formation of the Culper Spy Ring, which includes a mix of military officials and also civilians. It operates under the direction of Benjamin Talmadge, also known as John Bolton, not the mustachioed envoy to the United Nations a few years ago, but the first John Bolton. Talmadge, he only recruits people that he could absolutely trust. This is the first order of importance, not their rank or whatever. And it begins with his childhood friend, the farmer Abraham Woodhull, who went by the name Samuel Culper Sr., and Caleb Brewster, whose task during the Revolution was commanding a fleet of whaleboats against the British and Tory shipping on Long Island Sound. Brewster was the only member whom the British had definitely identified as a spy. Woodhull began running the group's day-to-day operations on Long Island, and he also personally traveled back and forth to New York, collecting information and observing naval maneuvers there. He'd evaluate reports and determine which information would be worth sending to Washington. So the way it would work is a tip would originate with Robert Townsend or Samuel Culper Jr. He was a coffee shop owner of what was considered a loyalist coffee shop, and he was a society reporter. He would pass along scoops he overheard at gatherings of the British elite. Coffee shops, a very, very short aside, they are known as, in sociological terms, as a third place between workplace and home that become popular in the 16th and 17th century. I think in England during the Glorious Revolution, or maybe, no, it's the Restoration, where James outlaws coffee shops because they think they are the site of seditious behavior. Anyway, great place for gossip, broadsheets, and learn about what's going on. So Robert Townsend, or Samuel Culper Jr., is the ring's primary source in the city. If he found information that was actionable, he might communicate that message by Anna Strong. She was a housewife who would hang clothes on her clothesline in a specific manner to indicate that intelligence had been gathered. Or a valuable nugget might be hidden away at a farm owned by Abraham Woodhull. Then the information would be picked up and transported by Caleb Brewster, who would carry the intelligence across the Sound to Fairfield, Connecticut. And then Talmadge would then pass on the information to Washington. So that's an example of how it might work, but there'd be other pieces involved too. The Culper Spy Ring really achieved a lot. The information collected and passed on by the ring from 1778 to the war's end in 1783 concerned key British troop movements, fortifications, and plans in New York and then surrounding region as well. Probably the group's greatest achievement came in 1780 when it uncovered British plans to ambush the newly arrived French army in Rhode Island. If the spy ring hadn't warned Washington, the Franco-American alliance might have been damaged or destroyed by a surprise attack. The Culper Spy Ring is also credited with uncovering information involving the treason of Benedict Arnold and his correspondence with John Andre, the chief intelligence officer under General Henry Clinton. Andre was captured and hung as a spy in October 1780 on Washington's orders. Yeah, so that's the general overview, but do you have any other info on how the Culper Spy Ring worked, James?
Yeah, I do actually. I'm a big fan of the Culper Spy ring. You know, I've got a T-shirt and a hat. No, I'm just kidding.
A costume.
Yeah, a tricorn hat that says Culper Spy ring. No, but anyway, yes. Few things I want to mention. I've read a couple of books pretty recently about them, and I do recommend them to the listeners. One of them, Scott's already mentioned it once, but let me mention it again. It's called Washington Spies by Alexander Rose, the story of America's first spy ring. It's mainly about the Culper ring, but it also talks about Nathan Hale and other spies. And Scott and I have both read it and really enjoyed it. So, and it's not that long. It's a quick read, easy read. I think it's maybe about 300 pages of text, not counting the notes. Another one that came out more recently is called Washington Secret 6, and it's by Brian Kilmeade, who actually, his day job is a commentator for Fox News. I think he hosts one of their shows, but he's also a amateur historian, and he writes books on American history with a partner who's probably more of an academic historian. Kilmeade's book is a little less scholarly, but it's a fun read. I'm not saying he doesn't know what he's talking about, because like I said, he has a partner that works with him, but it's a fun read too. It talks about the Culper ring and everything they do. So one or both of those books, the Kilmeade book is all about the Culpers, whereas Washington Spies gives a little bit broader picture of espionage. But I want to talk about some of the methods they used in the Culper ring to get messages across. You had to be careful. You couldn't just write out things in just regular English, because what if somebody finds it? What if somebody captures your document? So they would use a variety of methods. One thing they used was invisible ink, a very early version of this, and it was not just lemon juice that you heat up. They actually had someone who was a chemist who came up with this formula that would actually it would look like nothing. And sometimes they would write entire letters in invisible ink, and they would be just they would look like blank sheets of paper, but when you held it over a candle, or the writing would appear. Other times they would just have a regular innocuous looking letter, maybe something like a grocery list, or something like, or a bill, or a list of goods, and then in the margins they would put the actual message in invisible ink. So that's pretty interesting. Another thing they used was stencils, and this was used fairly widely at the time. It wasn't just the Culper ring. The British used them as well. But what you would do, and this amazes me, Scott, they would write a letter, and it would seem to be fairly innocuous. Maybe it was orders. I mean, it wouldn't be military orders, because that's something you don't want to get out in the open. But I don't know. I can't say what specifically they would write, but they would write a letter that didn't seem to really say much of significance. But then they would make a stencil. So you'd have a piece of cardboard or the equivalent of it. I don't know if they had cardboard back then. Maybe so. It doesn't matter. But the point is they would have another sheet that would have certain parts cut out. And when you lay that on top of the original letter that seemed to say nothing significant, certain key words would be exposed. I don't know if that makes sense. Am I explaining that clearly, Scott?
It makes sense to me.
Yeah, you would have just rectangles cut out of the second paper with thicker paper, and then you would see the actual words, and it would say something like, it would eliminate 90% of the text of the original letter, and you would only see a few words, but that would be your key message, like send Captain so-and-so to some place, or something like that. So that was kind of neat. You would have the message would be hiding in plain sight, and you'd have to have the right stencil. A third thing they used was a code, and of course every spies use code and have from the dawn of time. Some codes today are very, very elaborate, but the code they used was really ingenious. What they did was they would substitute numbers for certain keywords. Now, they didn't want to take the time. It would take too much time to assign a number to every single possible word you could use. So they would write these messages that were part words and part numbers. For example, I'm looking in Alexander Rose's book right now, Washington Spies. The word 10 represented New York City. I'm sorry, the letter, let me try the third time. The number 10 represents New York City. The number 20 was Setauket. That was Abraham Woodhull's base of operations where he lived and had his farm. 30 and 40 represented two post riders, one named Jonas Hawkins and one named Austin Rowe, both of whom helped the Culper Ring. The word, like General Washington was 711. General Clinton was 712. Benjamin Talmadge, who was Washington's spy director, he was the director of the Culper Ring. He was the one that Scott mentioned would receive messages from the others and send them to Washington. He was 721. Samuel Culper, which was the code name for Woodhull, he was 722, and so on. So here's an example message. Here's one that was sent on August 6th. I'm not sure who sent it to whom, but it says, sorry, 626-280 cannot give 707 an exact count. 431-625 situation 431-625-635 -707-373 think 626-280-249. Anyway, so if that message fell into the hands of a loyalist or a British officer, they would just say, what does that mean? That makes no sense. But if someone had the book, that there were a couple of copies of the book, Washington had one, or probably Talmadge actually, Woodhull would have one. They would know exactly what that meant because they could look up what do all those numbers mean. So the passage I just read, if you translate it into all regular English, it would say, sorry that I cannot give you an exact account of the situation of the troops. You may think that I have not taken sufficient pains to obtain it. I assure you that I have, and I find it more difficult than I expected, and so on and so on, things like that. So I thought that was really, really cool. Interesting code. Now, a couple more things I want to mention before we move on, if I may. And one of those is, we've talked about a couple books, but there's also a wonderful TV series, and it was on, I think, AMC. I might be wrong about that. It doesn't matter, but as of the time we record this, we're recording this in July of 2019. I don't know when you guys will be listening to it, but as of July 2019, the entire series is on Netflix. So you can if you have Netflix, you can watch the whole thing. You can binge watch it. It's a fantastic show, and it's called Turn: Washington Spies. Now, I do have to say this, like a lot of shows that are based on history, it is not completely accurate. There's a lot of liberties taken, but I do think they get the big picture right. I think that the overall idea of what was going on is faithfully captured, even if some of the details are changed. You know, they have to put in love stories and all that, and near misses, and they try to make, although I think the story is interesting enough as it is, but nevertheless, I hardly recommend this show. It has Washington as a character. It has, in addition to the spying episodes, it shows the Battle of Yorktown. It has the whole Benedict Arnold treason with John Andre and the near miss of capturing Benedict Arnold, which we discussed in a previous episode. And we're going to look at it from a different angle in just a little bit here. But definitely, folks, you've got to go watch this show if you can. And if it's off Netflix by the time you hear this, get the DVDs or try to find another place. Maybe you'll be on Hulu or something else. So,
hey everyone, Scott here. One more brief word from our sponsors.
One more person I want to mention is a man named Hercules Mulligan. Hercules Mulligan was another spy, and he sometimes worked with the Culper Ring, but for the most part, he was a free agent, worked on his own. He was a friend of Alexander Hamilton's, and he was supposedly a loyalist. He was a tailor, and so he would take measurements of people, and British officers would come in and they'd talk to him and they'd tell him things, probably tell him too much that they shouldn't tell him. And so Mulligan would see to it that this information got passed to ultimately to Washington. He also had a slave named Cato who also helped him out with intelligence. So it wasn't just Mulligan, but it was also this slave named Cato. Cato, who would suspect the slave, right, of being a spy? But he did. He occasionally delivered messages from Mulligan to George Washington or to Hamilton. He revealed a plot, for example, Mulligan and Cato, that the British were planning to kidnap or kill American leaders, including Washington. There were definitely plots against Washington's life. Things like that. So Mulligan is worthy of mention, even though he's not really front and center, a real official member of the Culper Ring. And I also have to mention this. I cannot go without mentioning at least one more time the Alexander Hamilton musical. Mulligan is actually a pretty major character in the first part of that. He's part of a group of 4 friends that included Hamilton, Mulligan, Lafayette, and John Lawrence. So there you go. Take a drink, people. I'll mention Hamilton one more time. And maybe I'll mention it again. Who knows?
Yeah.
That's all I have, Scott.
All right. One more thing I want to mention before we look at the attempt to capture Benedict Arnold. I think this is one of those universal lessons of history, listeners, that people who know things are those who are hiding in plain sight, whom everyone underestimates. So you mentioned a slave, Cato. British would probably just their brain would just block him out as background and not even care what they're saying. Anna Strong, thinking, well, this woman hanging up clothes on a clothesline, what could she possibly know when she's communicating classified military intelligence? Or an example from a very different time in history, when Lyndon B. Johnson was a young representative or senator on Capitol Hill and had no standing, was trying to figure out who the power brokers were, he asked the coat man at the Senate building, who are the movers and shakers here? And the coat man was someone that everyone overlooked, but he knew everyone, and he answered him. So there you go. The lesson in history, the people who know everything are the people that everyone overlooks.
Yes, Scott, I've just remembered one other thing I wanted to mention. 2 things. First of all, in the show Turn that I mentioned a minute ago, and again, folks, you've got to see this fantastic show. One of the spies is actually a slave woman, and she's not a historical character, but I think she may represent Cato, Hercules Mulligan's slave. She works for Arnold for a while or deals with Arnold. And so that's an interesting thing how they put that in there. But also, regarding Anna Strong, historians actually aren't 100% sure that she was involved in the Culper Ring. In the Culper Ring, there definitely was a woman involved, but she was just called 355, and there's her name was never revealed. We don't know who she was. She's just 355. It's kind of exotic, right? Like Agent 007 or Maxwell Smart, Agent 86. But so it may or may not have been Anna Strong. Kilme doesn't think that it was, and I forget where Alexander Rose comes down on this. I didn't have time to research that. It's been a while since I read the book. But so maybe it was Anna Strong, maybe somebody else. But in the show, it's definitely Anna Strong, and they make her into a very, forgive the pun, a strong female character. She's a great character. So anyway, maybe it was, maybe it wasn't, but the Culper Ring did so much good. I don't know that Washington could have done what he did in the last part of the war without them.
Credit where credit is due. And a story that we had to include is the attempt to capture Benedict Arnold and how it goes wrong. It's really crazy.
Oh, I know. This is such a great story.
Well, after Benedict Arnold, he deserts the British camp, Washington is mad as a hornet. Every fiber of his being, his idea of duty and loyalty and chivalry is on fire. He wants to hang Benedict Arnold for treason and make the biggest example he possibly could out of him. So the story of the attempts to capture him in Washington Spies and other accounts, it actually begins at the camp of Light Horse Harry Lee. On October 20th, 1780, one of his sergeants, a sergeant major, John Champ, slipped past the camp guards, and he trotted out on a road that ran southwest towards Bergen. Which looks like treason. It looks like he's fleeing the Patriot camp to go defect to the British.
Yeah, just another deserter.
Right, just thinking that the war isn't going well. In Communipaw Bay, beyond Bergen near New York Bay, there were 2 British warships, and the deserting sergeant hoped to reach it by daylight. While out, after about an hour after leaving the camp, he's challenged by a Continental outpost. He spurs past them and in a short race outran them. The patrol then runs back to Major Henry Lee, asking permission to send off a pursuit party at once. And Washington Spies has a pretty funny account of this, where they would have thought that Lee would immediately spring out of bed and run to mount the troops and catch them. Lee dithers like a Union general in the beginning of the Civil War.
That's a good analogy.
He spends about 20 or 30 minutes arguing that they're mistaken. He demands that they go inspect for Champ's horse. They return. He demands to personally inspect all the horses. He's spending as long as he possibly can. But Lee is doing this deliberately because he knows that Champ is fleeing the camp, because he wanted him to defect, because his desertion is planned by Lee in Washington to infiltrate British lines and to capture Benedict Arnold in New York. He wants Lee or Champ to capture Arnold so he can be brought back and sentenced and hanged to make an example out of Arnold. So Lee, the plan goes like this. Champ was a veteran of 23 or 24. He'd been singled out as a very promising youth of uncommon tacturnity and inflexible perseverance. Sounds like a young Nathan Hale. So the plan is that he's to desert to the British at New York, enlist in the corps that Benedict Arnold was known to be raising, and he was to insinuate himself in a berth close to the traitor while, quote, maintaining correspondence and meetings every second day with an American agent. And the agent would come in from Newark and make himself known as Mr. Baldwin. When a favorable night presented itself, they were to somehow seize Arnold and, under cover of darkness, bound him, gag him, and get him across the Hudson to Bergen Woods. An American patrol would meet them and escort them to headquarters.
Great plan. What could go wrong?
Sounds perfect. Well, Henry Lee said, the only thing that I can do is to try to delay troops if they do come after you. I can't give you any other escort. This has to be a top secret plan because troops have to think that you really did defect for it to work. Because if everyone knows that you are not actually defecting, then word is going to get back to the British and you're going to be hung. We know how, going to be hanged. That was improper grammar. Sorry there, listeners. Sorry.
Oh, we can't have that. Not on this show.
Improper grammar is something up with which we will not put.
Good.
Yeah. All right. So Champ, when he's fleeing, there are patriots who are pursuing him at gallop. He's picked up by a British gun crew that realized an American deserter was trying to reach them. He gave his name to his rescuers and said he wished to take British protection in New York. He was held for questioning for a few days and then offered the opportunity to enlist in the British Army, but he convinced his benefactors that doing so would greatly increase his risk of being captured and hanged by the rebels. So they were satisfied to turn him loose and find employment in Manhattan and support the Manhattan economy. His next step is to place himself in good standing with Benedict Arnold. Well, Champ ran across Arnold pretty quickly, and now Arnold is a British brigadier general, and Champ's earnest manner seemed convincing to Arnold, as the sergeant told him he'd been inspired to desert a lost cause by Arnold's own example and flatters him.
Yeah, play to Arnold's ego. It works every time.
Yeah, that, you know what, Arnold, you've been overlooked in this entire war. That, yeah, I have. I haven't.
Yeah.
Tell me more. So Arnold offers him a post in his Loyalist Legion. Champ planned with Mr. Baldwin upon an appointment on a specific night to pounce on Arnold, stick a gag in his mouth, and drag him through the fence into an alley. They'd take him to a waiting boat at a pier behind the headquarters house.
Yeah, he had another guy that was going to help him, so just so the listeners don't think it's going to be a one-on-one thing.
It's not like he had to knock him out, hit him on the back of a head with a vase. And well, so the plan is the two would drag him, and if a sentry challenged them, then they'd say they were taking home a drunken friend back to their house after too much Madeira or rum, depending on what the officer's rank was. They planned on December 11th to take Arnold, but before nightfall, Arnold confronted Champ with an order. He was to embark at once with the rest of the Loyalist Legion on the transports in the harbor for a voyage to Virginia for a British expedition to the Chesapeake. And Champ couldn't do anything. He had to join the troops going up the gangplanks. And while Arnold, who is burning and pillaging Virginia, Champ is joining him. He's marching with him, and he has to fight against his own country and comrades. and he was scared that it could be possible he might face his own corps in battle. And again, no one knows about what he's up to except for Henry Lee. So if he's captured and identified as a former American, he could be tried and executed unless word somehow got back to Henry Lee, who could then save him.
Yeah, it's a very uncomfortable position to be in.
Yeah, I don't know if he thought about this before he enlisted or thought, well, that's probably not going to happen, but here he is. So before Arnold was recalled to New York in the late spring, Champ managed to desert from the British camp. He had experience as a deserter once, so he can do it again.
Yeah, this is the real desertion this time.
So Lee later recalled, much later in his writings, that it was May when Champ showed up at the Legion camp, and Champ was able to successfully get back after a very difficult journey. His mission failed, but Lee granted him an honorary discharge and sent him as a civilian back to the remote security of Loudoun County in Virginia to sit out the rest of the war. Unfortunately, he didn't receive any reward and died years before the Congress in 1818 established pensions for Revolutionary veterans. But when his widow was nearly 80 in 1837, she was granted $120 per year as a needy, basically a relic of the Revolutionary War. Champ was given a posthumous promotion in 1847 in regards to his special service when the Congress granted his descendants an amount equal to the commutation pay of an ensign in the Continental Service. So he was recognized much later, but...
Yeah, better late than never.
I guess so. I mean, so sadly.
I guess. I don't know, man. I don't know if it helped him a whole lot.
So risked life, but unfortunately wasn't given the recognition for what he did. All right, well, let's look at one more thing of just in general, what did spies contribute to the war? We looked at the Culper Ring, we looked at the Knowlton Rangers, we looked at individual characters. So what did they accomplish? Well, military intelligence operations branched out in several directions during the war. Washington deployed his own agents like Hercules Mulligan, the tailor, who could conceal and deliver messages through his business. And Washington spies had a variety of methods to maintain secrecy and gather intelligence. Like James said, they had ciphers, code names, book codes, and propaganda. And Washington, in addition to gathering intelligence through the Culper Ring and other means, he also used subterfuge. He would allow messages to be captured that he hoped would be captured that contained false intelligence. So Washington would exaggerate the size and strength of his forces in conversations with British supporters. The Culper Ring, when they were mingled in New York, would say, oh, did you hear the Continentals? They have 20,000 men camped out in New York, whatever. He'd spread false messages about military movements and attacks on forts and send them via the regular post to ensure they'd be intercepted. Using invisible ink, that was, I think one of the chemists was James J., John Jay's brother.
Yeah, that's right. I forgot to mention that. That's interesting.
Yeah. So the legacy of all this, I think one of the many legacies, is that Washington laid the groundwork for today's intelligence community, and recognizing that civilian observation and mobilization and insight is just as important as military might. One defeated British intelligence officer is quoted as saying, Washington did not really outfight the British. He simply outspied us. I don't know. What do you think? Do you think that's true, James? Or can you think of any other legacies of intelligence in the war?
I think that is an overstatement, but I think it certainly the Washington's superior spy network, his superior espionage activities definitely helped tip the balance in the Americans' favor. There is one other thing that I was going to mention earlier and forgot, but I do want to mention it now. One other thing the Culper Ring did that we did not mention was they helped expose and I don't know if defeat is the right word, but they helped at least mollify the effects of one British activity that was not a military activity. During the war, the British started printing continental dollars, and their plan was to just print and print and print more counterfeit continental dollars to circulate those to get them out in the open. And the more dollars that were in circulation, the less the value of each dollar. In other words, everybody, if you know basic economics, you know when you print money, the more money you get out in circulation floating around, the less the value of the money. So they were trying to reduce the value of continental money, the British were, by putting too much out there, and the Culpers helped expose that. And I don't know, we touched on this, but the reason, did we talk about why it was called the Culper Ring?
Well, I know the code names were Culper Sr. and Culper Jr., but that's all I know.
Yeah, that was just a name. Nobody knows exactly where that came from. There's an idea that it was going to be Culpeper, and that was too long, and Woodhull didn't like it. At least in the show. In the show, they have him just shorten it to Culper. But yeah, Abraham Woodhull was Culper, and Robert Townsend, the one who ran the store and the coffee shop, he was Culper Jr. So just a great story and a fun topic. And again, folks, if we've whet your appetite on this topic, definitely read the book by Alexander Rose, Washington Spies. Maybe read the Kilmeade one too, and definitely watch the show Turn if at all possible. You will not regret it.
All right, so there you are, some recommended reading. So those are Spies in the Revolutionary War. We ended the episode before this at the American victory at Yorktown, but the war isn't officially over until a peace treaty is signed. So we need to see everything that happens, and then we also need to see what happens to all of these different colorful characters that we met during the Revolutionary War. Are they going to be successful businessmen? Will they be completely bankrupt? Will they die in disgrace? Will they die in some strange foreign land? We'll find out all these things in the next episode. Thanks for listening to the Key Battles of the Revolutionary War podcast. If you'd like more info, go to keybattlesoftherevolutionarywar.com, where you'll find show notes, maps, and other resources that we talk about in these episodes. And if you like the show, please rate and review us on the podcast player of your choice. It helps us grow the show and reach new listeners. Until next time, my friends, grab your tankard of ale or glass of Madeira and raise a toast to liberty. I'm Scott from the History Unplugged podcast. History can be a bit of a tongue twister with its weird-sounding names of people, places, and things, but it really isn't that confusing. History is the story of who we are and how we comport ourselves while soaring to victory in battles over forts, seaports, and cities that fortunately thwarted the schemes of villains and their blood sports, like the 1415 Battle of Agincourt. It's about legal battles in courts, about the contortion of torts over the retorts of consorts that turned into kangaroo courts. I exhort you to listen to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice, and you can listen to it while wearing shirts, shorts, skirts, skirts, or jean jorts.